The sun rose with an effortless grace over Crestwood Park, casting its golden rays onto the vibrant tapestry of suburban life. Children squealed with delight as they chased one another across the sprawling green lawn, their laughter mingling with the rhythmic swish of joggers' feet on gravel paths. Nearby, elderly couples strolled arm in arm, their pace unhurried, while young parents guided toddlers along winding trails. The air carried a hum of activity, a symphony of normalcy that made the park a sanctuary from the outside world. Among the morning crowd, Angela Davis walked briskly, her head held high, her posture radiating confidence. She wore a neatly tailored blazer over casual slacks, her steps purposeful as she carried a small bag from the local bakery, a reward for an early morning errand accomplished. Her caramel skin glowed under the sunlight, and her locks framed her face like a crown, amplifying her presence as she navigated the path toward her home just a few blocks away. People occasionally glanced her way, noting her elegance, her calm demeanor, and the way she seemed so at ease in her surroundings. But Angela's peaceful morning was about to take an unexpected turn. As she reached the edge of the park, a faint discomfort began to ripple through her chest. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than fatigue from skipping breakfast, but the sensation quickly escalated into a sharp, relentless pain. She stopped abruptly, clutching the edge of a lamppost for support, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her bakery bag tumbled to the ground, the fresh aroma of croissants wafting unnoticed as panic began to set in. She glanced around, trying to catch the eye of a passer-by, but the busy park-goers seemed preoccupied with their own lives. The world blurred slightly as the pain intensified, and a bead of sweat rolled down her temple despite the mild morning temperature. Angela tried to call out, her voice strained and barely audible. "Excuse me, I need help." The words dissolved into the air, unheard. Just then, the distinct hum of a police cruiser caught her attention. The black and white vehicle rolled slowly to a stop across the street, its engine idling as the officer inside surveyed the area. Relief surged through Angela for a fleeting moment. Help had arrived. Surely the officer would notice her distress and come to her aid. But the relief was short-lived. The officer, a middle-aged man with a clean-shaven face and mirrored sunglasses that obscured his eyes, leaned back in his seat. His posture was one of practiced indifference, the kind that suggested he had seen too much in his years on the force, or perhaps chosen to see very little. He didn't step out of the car. Instead, his gaze lingered on Angela, his expression unreadable, but tinged with an air of quiet judgment. Angela mustered her remaining strength, raising her hand in a feeble wave to signal for help. Her heart raced, the pain now radiating down her left arm. Her plea was unmistakable, yet the officer remained unmoved. His hand rested idly on the steering wheel, his demeanor cool and detached. He glanced briefly at her before turning his head to scan the park, as if weighing whether her situation warranted his attention. The tension was palpable, even from a distance. Angela could feel the weight of his hesitation, the way his inaction carried an unspoken narrative. To him, perhaps, she was just another face, a stranger in a neighborhood where she didn't quite fit the mold of who should need help, or who deserved it. She stumbled, catching herself against a park bench, her knees threatening to give way. A nearby couple noticed her plight and hurried over. "Are you okay?" the woman asked. Her voice filled with concern as she placed a steadying hand on Angela's shoulder. I think it's my heart," Angela managed to say, her voice trembling with fear. The man pulled out his phone to call for an ambulance, glancing toward the police car as he did so. "Hey!" he shouted. waving his arm to get the officer's attention. "Someone's in trouble over here." The officer didn't move at first. He tilted his head slightly, his sunglasses catching the sunlight as he considered the scene. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his utility belt with a deliberate slowness that sent a clear message. He was in no rush. He approached with measured steps, his expression neutral. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone flat, almost disinterested. "She's in pain," the woman replied sharply. "We think it might be a heart attack." Angela tried to steady her breathing, her vision swimming as she looked up at the officer. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible. The officer's gaze flicked to her, then back to the couple. "Has anyone called 911?" he asked, as though he couldn't be bothered to make the call himself. "Yes, I'm on the phone with them now," the man said, his frustration evident. "But she needs help now." The officer nodded curtly, then stepped back, folding his arms as if his role in the situation was now complete. He made no move to assist, no effort to comfort or reassure. Instead, he glanced around at the gathering onlookers, his expression unreadable, but undeniably detached. Angela's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and disbelief. Was this really happening? Was she being reduced to a judgment call, her humanity weighed against an unspoken bias? She could feel her strength waning, the edges of her consciousness fraying, as the world around her seemed to narrow to the officer's impassive stance. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tension, the ambulance's approach offering a glimmer of hope. The officer stepped aside as the paramedics arrived, his presence now entirely unnecessary. They worked quickly, assessing Angela's condition and stabilizing her before loading her onto the stretcher. As the ambulance doors closed, Angela's gaze lingered on the officer, who was already retreating to his car. Her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, carried an unspoken question, a quiet demand for accountability that the officer would likely never answer. The ambulance pulled away, its siren wailing as it disappeared down the street. The park slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the onlookers dispersing, their curiosity fading. Yet the moment lingered, an unspoken tension hanging in the air, a stark reminder of the fragility of both life and human empathy. And for Angela, as she lay on the stretcher, her heart aching in more ways than one, a resolve began to take shape, an unyielding determination to confront not just the crisis she had endured, but the deeper injustices that had allowed it to happen. Angela Davis was a woman of unwavering determination and boundless compassion. Known in her community as a beacon of strength and professionalism, she had earned the respect of those around her through years of hard work and dedication. That morning, like so many others, she moved through her routine with a sense of purpose. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled her kitchen, as sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the space. She hummed softly while arranging a bouquet of flowers for an upcoming family gathering, a small but meaningful way to bring joy to her loved ones. Her days were often filled with tasks for her role as a community advocate. Whether it was consulting on housing initiatives or mentoring young women, Angela poured her heart into her work. She approached challenges with an optimistic outlook, even in the face of biases and obstacles that had shaped much of her life. As a Black woman in a position of influence, she had encountered her share of prejudice, but she refused to let it define her. Instead, Angela focused on building bridges, believing that dignity and grace were her strongest tools for breaking down barriers. Meanwhile, her husband, Marcus, was preparing for his own day. A calm and composed man with a quiet strength Marcus was Angela's rock, her confidant and unwavering supporter. At that moment, he was working from their home office, surrounded by stacks of financial reports and the hum of his laptop. His demeanor was steady, his mind focused on his tasks, but Angela was never far from his thoughts. He admired her deeply, not just for her accomplishments, but for the way she carried herself with integrity and kindness. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and understanding, where Angela brought fiery passion and a drive for change. Marcus balanced it with his thoughtful, deliberate approach to life's challenges. He was the kind of person who listened carefully before speaking, who considered all angles before acting. His moral compass was unshakable, and it guided him in everything he did. As Marcus sipped his coffee, he thought about their plans for the evening, a quiet dinner with close family and friends. It was a rare opportunity for them to unwind and reconnect in the midst of their busy lives. He smiled, imagining Angela's laugh filling their home, her presence always bringing warmth and light. But the tranquility of their morning was about to be disrupted. As Marcus glanced at his phone, a news alert caught his attention. Incident reported at Crestwood Park. It was a vague headline, but it sparked a flicker of unease. Crestwood Park was a place Angela often passed through during her errands, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A moment later, his phone buzzed with a call from a neighbor who had witnessed a troubling scene, a police officer confronting a woman who matched Angela's description. The neighbor's voice was hurried and concerned, and as Marcus listened, his heart sank. He thanked them for the call, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what might have happened. Marcus's protective instincts kicked in, but he remained composed. Reacting rashly wouldn't help Angela, and he knew that his role now was to support her and take decisive action to ensure justice was served. Grabbing his keys, Marcus left the house, his thoughts entirely on Angela. He replayed their morning conversation in his mind, her confident voice and steady resolve echoing as he drove toward Crestwood Park. For Marcus, there was no question about what needed to be done. His love for Angela and his commitment to doing what was right would guide him, just as they always had. Whatever awaited him at the park, he was ready to face it, with Angela's dignity and their shared strength as his foundation. The morning was alive with the usual hum of city life, the chatter of pedestrians, and the distant rumble of traffic. Angela Davis, carrying the resolve and energy that marked her every step, was on her way home after a quick errand. She felt accomplished, ticking off her morning tasks and thinking about the family dinner she was preparing for later in the evening. The sun was warm on her face, the air filled with the subtle fragrance of blooming flowers and fresh coffee wafting from a nearby cafe. Then, in an instant, her world shifted. As Angela crossed the intersection near Crestwood Park, a sharp, sudden pain seized her chest. She froze mid-step, the bakery bag in her hand falling to the ground as she instinctively clutched her chest. Her breathing grew shallow, and the world around her blurred. Stumbling to the sidewalk, she managed to find the edge of a bench, gripping it for balance. Onlookers began to notice, their expressions turning from curiosity to concern, as Angela's strength seemed to wane with each passing second. "Are you all right, ma'am?" a woman asked, stepping closer. Angela tried to respond, but her voice was faint, her words unintelligible. A crowd began to gather, their worried murmurs filling the air. "She needs help," someone said. "Call 911. A young man pulled out his phone and dialed, speaking quickly to the dispatcher. "There's a woman here. She's collapsed near Crestwood Park. She needs an ambulance immediately. Among the growing group of onlookers, a child pointed toward the street. "Look, a police car," he exclaimed. Heads turned as the black and white vehicle rolled up to the scene, its lights flashing but siren silent. Relief swept through the crowd. Surely an officer would know what to do. Help had arrived, or so they thought. The officer, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped out of the car and approached the group with measured steps. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but his posture radiated detachment. Angela sat slumped on the bench, her chest heaving as she struggled for air, her complexion pale, and her forehead beaded with sweat. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice clipped and devoid of urgency. "She's in distress," the young man with the phone exclaimed. "We think it might be a heart attack or something. She needs medical attention." The officer nodded slightly, looking down at Angela, but making no move to assist. Instead, he pulled out a small notepad and began jotting something down. "Have you called an ambulance?" he asked, without lifting his gaze. "Yes, we have," the woman who first approached Angela replied. "But she's deteriorating fast. Can't you do something?" The officer straightened, adjusting his utility belt. "If you've already called an ambulance, then there's not much more I can do," he said flatly. "I'm not a medic." A ripple of frustration moved through the crowd. "But you're here," someone said. "She needs help now." The officer shrugged, his tone growing more dismissive. "Look, I don't see anything life-threatening here. She's conscious, isn't she? I've got other calls to attend to." Angela, still struggling to breathe, managed to look up at the officer, her eyes pleading. "Please," she whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. Instead of responding, the officer took a step back, folding his arms. "I can't administer medical care," he said, his tone almost defensive. "We need to wait for the paramedics. Protocol is protocol." By now, the onlookers were growing visibly angry. One man stepped forward, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You're just going to stand there while she's suffering? Are you serious?" The officer turned to face him, his expression hardening. "Sir, I'm doing my job. I suggest you let me handle the situation." "Handle it?" the man shot back. "You're not doing anything." The tension escalated as more people joined the argument, their voices blending into a chaotic chorus of outrage. Amid the commotion, Angela's condition continued to worsen. She slumped further on the bench, her head resting against the backrest, her breaths shallow and labored. Just then, a car pulled up nearby, screeching to a halt. Marcus Davis stepped out, his face etched with worry and urgency. He had been working from home when a neighbor called to inform him about the incident at the park, describing a woman who matched Angela's description. He'd driven over as fast as he could, his heart pounding with dread. "Angela!" he called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. Angela's head turned weakly in his direction, her eyes fluttering open just enough to meet his gaze. Marcus rushed to her side, kneeling beside the bench and taking her hand in his. "I'm here," he said softly, his voice steady, despite the fear churning inside him. "I'm here, Angela." He quickly assessed her condition, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions within him. "What happened?" he asked, looking up at the group of bystanders. "She collapsed," the young man with the phone said. "We called for an ambulance, but it hasn't arrived yet." Marcus's gaze shifted to the officer, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching the scene with an air of detachment. "And what are you doing?" Marcus asked, his voice low but firm. The officer's expression didn't change. "Sir, I've assessed the situation. The ambulance is on its way. There's nothing more I can do." Nothing more you can do? Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly. She's in distress, and you're standing there like it's not your problem. The officer took a step closer, his tone defensive. I'm not a medical professional, sir. It's not my job to provide care. Marcus stood, his imposing presence radiating controlled anger. It is your job to serve and protect, he said, his voice steady but laced with intensity. Right now, you're failing at both. The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration echoing Marcus's sentiments. The officer shifted uncomfortably, but before he could respond, the distant sound of sirens broke through the tension. The ambulance was finally approaching. Marcus turned his attention back to Angela, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Hold on, Angela," he said softly. "Help is here." The paramedics arrived moments later, their efficiency a stark contrast to the officer's inaction. They quickly assessed Angela's condition, administering oxygen and preparing her for transport. Marcus stayed by her side, holding her hand as they loaded her onto the stretcher. As the ambulance doors closed, Marcus turned to the officer one last time. His expression was calm, but his words carried the weight of unspoken accountability. "You had a chance to make a difference today, and you chose not to. Think about that." The officer didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the ground as the crowd began to disperse. Marcus climbed into the ambulance, his focus entirely on Angela as they sped toward the hospital. For him, the incident wasn't just a moment of crisis, it was a turning point, one that would demand justice and accountability for the woman he loved. Marcus knelt by Angela, holding her hand tightly as her labored breaths filled the tense silence. The crowd, once buzzing with frustration, grew still as Marcus rose to his full height and turned to face the officer. His calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to the rising anger in his voice. "Why didn't you step in when my wife collapsed? She could have died while you stood there doing nothing." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance beginning to waver under the weight of Marcus's scrutiny. "Sir, I was following protocol. Medical emergencies are for paramedics." "Protocol?" Marcus interrupted, his voice steady but commanding. "Protocol doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to help someone in distress. You had the tools, the authority, and the opportunity, but you chose to do nothing." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand, cutting him off. The phone in Marcus's other hand was recording, its screen reflecting the scene back at the officer. "Don't bother justifying your inaction," Marcus said coldly. "This is all being documented, and believe me, I know exactly where to take it." The crowd, emboldened by Marcus's firm stance, began murmuring their agreement. Phones were lifted high, capturing every word. The officer's posture stiffened as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just another confrontation. Marcus wasn't just another angry bystander. The whispers of recognition rippled through the gathering onlookers. "Isn't he the civil rights lawyer?" one person asked. "The one who's taken on police misconduct cases." Marcus's reputation preceded him. A prominent figure in the fight for justice, he had spent years dismantling systemic failures with precision and determination. And now, standing in defense of his wife, he exuded an authority that left no room for doubt. "I know my rights," Marcus continued, his gaze locked on the officer. "More importantly, I know your responsibilities. Your failure to act isn't just a moral failure. It's a dereliction of duty, and it won't go unnoticed." The officer's discomfort deepened as Marcus began issuing clear instructions to the crowd. "Someone call the paramedics again and confirm their ETA," he said. "And someone else notify the store across the street. Make sure they're keeping their security footage." The crowd sprang into action, their energy shifting from outrage to determination. Marcus turned back to Angela, his voice softening as he reassured her. "Help is coming, Angela. Stay with me." Behind him, the officer stood frozen, his earlier confidence completely eroded. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. The man he had dismissed so easily was now in control, his calm authority laying bare the officer's negligence. As cheers of encouragement erupted from the crowd, the officer's face reddened. He had underestimated Marcus, misjudged the situation, and now faced the weight of accountability. The moment was no longer his to control. It belonged to Marcus, and to the justice he vowed to uphold. As the wail of sirens pierced the air, Angela was finally attended to by paramedics, thanks to Marcus's relentless efforts. The crowd stepped aside as the emergency medical team worked swiftly, their movements a stark contrast to the earlier inaction of the officer. Marcus stayed close by Angela's side, his voice steady and calm as he reassured her. "You're going to be fine, Angela," he whispered, gripping her hand tightly as they lifted her onto the stretcher. The scene was alive with tension. The crowd, emboldened by Marcus's leadership, didn't let up in their condemnation of the officer's behavior. Cries of, "You should be ashamed," and "How could you just stand there?" echoed through the street. Phones remained aloft, capturing every moment, ensuring that the incident would not be buried or forgotten. Marcus turned his focus back to the officer, his composure unwavering. "I want your badge number," he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. The officer hesitated, his earlier confidence now replaced with visible discomfort. "I said your badge number," Marcus repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, the officer provided the information, scribbling it onto a piece of paper with trembling hands. Marcus took it without breaking eye contact, ensuring the officer understood the gravity of his actions. "This isn't over," Marcus said firmly. "You failed your duty today, and you will be held accountable." As the ambulance pulled away, taking Angela to the hospital, Marcus stayed behind to address the crowd. He raised his phone, still recording, and spoke with conviction. "What happened here today is unacceptable," he began. "This wasn't just negligence. It was prejudice. And it's not the first time something like this has happened, but we have the power to make sure it doesn't happen again." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, their energy shifting from outrage to solidarity. Marcus wasted no time. He began contacting local media outlets, ensuring the footage was shared widely. Within hours, the video of the incident was online, spreading rapidly across social media platforms. The hashtags number Justice for Angela and number Accountability Now trended nationwide, drawing attention to the officer's inaction and the broader issue of racial bias in law enforcement. The public backlash was immediate and overwhelming. News anchors dissected the footage on primetime television, while op-eds condemned the officer's behavior as a symptom of systemic prejudice. Activists and community leaders joined the conversation, calling for reforms and accountability. The police department, unable to ignore the growing outrage, issued a statement acknowledging the incident and promising a thorough investigation. By the following morning, the officer had been suspended pending further review. The department faced mounting pressure to address not just this specific incident, but the broader culture that allowed such behavior to persist. Marcus, leveraging his experience as a civil rights lawyer, ensured the momentum didn't falter. He collaborated with local advocacy groups to organize a public forum, inviting community members to share their experiences and demand change. Throughout it all, Marcus remained a pillar of strength, driven not only by his love for Angela, but also by his unwavering commitment to justice. At the hospital, he stayed by Angela's side as she recovered, updating her on the progress being made. "The world's watching now," he told her gently. "What happened to you is sparking something bigger." Angela, though still weak, managed a faint smile. "That's all I ever wanted, to make a difference," she whispered. As days turned into weeks, the incident continued to ripple through the community and beyond. The officer's actions, or lack thereof, became a symbol of the urgent need for accountability and reform. Marcus, with Angela's support, ensured that their voices, and the voices of countless others who had faced similar injustices, were heard loud and clear. As Angela recovered in the days following the harrowing incident, her strength and resilience became the foundation for a new chapter in her and Marcus's lives. The ordeal, though painful, ignited a sense of purpose they couldn't ignore. Marcus, fueled by his love for Angela and his commitment to justice, began laying the groundwork for a campaign aimed at systemic change. Together, they vowed to turn their experience into a powerful call for reform. Their first step was to launch a community-driven initiative advocating for mandatory racial bias training and stronger accountability measures within law enforcement. Through their combined efforts, they reached out to local leaders, civil rights organizations, and even law enforcement officials willing to listen. Angela's story, amplified by the viral video, became the catalyst for larger discussions about justice and equity. The community rallied behind them. Neighborhoods once divided by indifference came together in solidarity, organizing town halls and peaceful protests. Social media campaigns brought national attention, with hashtags like #JusticeForAngela and #BiasMustEnd gaining traction across the country. Angela, though still recovering, made appearances at events, sharing her experience with a composed yet powerful voice that resonated with everyone who heard her. Meanwhile, Marcus worked tirelessly behind the scenes, drafting proposals for policy changes and leveraging his legal expertise to ensure their demands couldn't be ignored. His calm, measured approach balanced Angela's passionate advocacy, and together they became a formidable force. Their mission wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about creating a system where no one else would have to endure what Angela had faced. The community's efforts bore fruit. The police department, under immense public pressure, began implementing new protocols, including regular racial bias training for all officers and a clearer system for reporting misconduct. The officer involved in Angela's case faced disciplinary action, but more importantly, the department committed to addressing the systemic issues that allowed such negligence to occur. As the sun dipped below the horizon on a particularly hectic day, Angela and Marcus finally had a moment to themselves. Sitting on their porch, the golden light of the setting sun bathed their home in warmth. Angela leaned into Marcus's shoulder, her hand resting gently in his. For the first time in days, there was a sense of calm. "You know," Angela began softly, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and determination, "I never thought something like this would happen to me, but I also never thought we could turn it into something bigger." Marcus looked at her, his expression steady and full of admiration. "They thought ignoring you would silence you," he said firmly. "Instead, we've given them a reason to listen." Angela smiled, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Together they had faced adversity and emerged stronger, their bond unshaken. Their actions had sparked not just a local movement, but a ripple effect of awareness and accountability that reached far beyond their community. As the light faded, they sat together, united and resolute. The fight for justice wasn't over, but they knew they had made a difference, and that their story would inspire others to do the same.